If you are responsible for an organization, it's not just about the performance metrics of the organization. It's about the people. It's about everything to do with the decisions you make. Even if the things that drive you are ego and legacy and whatever, again, why wouldn't you want to know? Why wouldn't you want to be informed? Why wouldn't you want to make the best decisions available? With the advent of technology at the current time, we are now seeing an ability to scale our information draw, which is just not feasible to do it manually.
Where AI can help is key leading indicators, because probably everything that is going to happen has happened numerous times before. In a year's time, based upon the capability that we've been working on collaboratively together, what would you see that capability being possible, which is not possible in this world today? This week on GAEA Talks, Jon Evett. Good to have you here.
Great to be here, Graham. Thank you.
So let's begin. You've got a fascinating background. I personally think you are one of the world's leading minds in the risk and resilience space, with a plan for the future of resilience that we've been working on a partnership together on this. I think it's going to have huge impact, but let's start off just for the viewer to understand who you are, where you began, what's your journey to where you are today.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, it's very kind to invite me onto the podcast, and particularly given some of the guests you've had on. So my career started back in the early 2000s, and I was a British military officer. I graduated from the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, into the Corps of Royal Engineers. Commissioned into the Engineers as a commander of soldiers, as a planner of operations, and lots of other things. I specialised from military engineering into high readiness forces. I was a parachute engineer, so providing engineer capability on the battlefield in support of the parachute infantry, alongside the parachute signals, parachute artillery, so in that whole airborne environment. And that's a unique environment where you are constantly faced with dynamic circumstances and dynamic risks. You're responsible for other people, you're responsible for delivering effect, and you are responsible for your own continuity and ensuring you can deliver. I further specialised in bomb disposal and counter-terrorist search, which led me to operations overseas, but also NATO appointments in command of multinational troops, and also working in support of Home Office special projects and counter-terrorism back in the UK. That focus around, particularly on the counter-terrorism side, is always about dynamic risk management, understanding what bad things can happen, understanding what is in your power to do now and to prepare for tomorrow. I thoroughly enjoyed my time in the military, had a fantastic career. My generation, arguably the British Army during the 2000s, was quite a busy generation. So when I left in 2008, I moved into risk still, but in the commercial environment. So in the private sector, I worked for Canary Wharf Group, who built the Canary Wharf estate in London, a private business district out to the east. And I headed up their business continuity and crisis management function to help deliver resilience for the organisation, whether it's managing the property or the construction arm building the property in the first place, and provide community resilience for the Canary Wharf corporate community.
Because this is not just small buildings, this is skyscrapers. It's one of the most high profile locations in London.
Yeah, it's an iconic site, and in the early 2000s, the terrorism threat in the UK was, as high as it's ever been. Canary Wharf was a location, it's an iconic business district. It at the time had, if I remember my numbers correctly, about 33 completed office buildings with about 80 office tenants and occupiers. It had about 200 retail units. It had a working population of around 100, 110,000 people.
Wow.
And it had a footfall of around 7 to 8 million people per week, whether working, visiting, shopping, or indeed helping to manage the estate. And that is juxtaposed with the fact that Canary Wharf sits in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, which is ethnically diverse in terms of community. It is religiously diverse in terms of community. At that time, that was part of the sort of risk consideration. And just also the symbol of inequality meant that, that location was really in need of a very robust and developed security and resilience program. I worked for a great team there, worked with some really great people, but decided after a few years I needed to go and do something a little bit different to develop my skills elsewhere. And I went in to mix my commercial experience with my military experience, and I went offshore to provide security protective services in hostile environments. So I worked in Iraq and North Africa, across the Middle East, and advising companies on market entry into post-conflict environments, providing security and training advice for businesses, for diplomatic missions, for non-governmental organizations, and basically anything in between. I also combined that with some time working with the British government out in West Africa during the Ebola crisis. I was the DFID, Department for International Development's Field Operations Chief of Staff. So managing and designing the response model district by district across the national programme, where I was able to understand the financial constraints of the donor partner international development environment because I'd worked in business. I was able to understand the physical threat management element because I'd worked in complex military planning, counterterrorism and deployed operations, but also working in these multiple, environments socially. In a humanitarian crisis, you're also working with a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different NGOs, governments, ministers, and in the NGOs, the partners delivering, but then you've got the funding elements, USAID, DFID as the examples, trying to coordinate all of these different musicians in the orchestra to deliver an effect.
And in a state of emergency.
In a state of emergency, yeah, a horrendous epidemic, but coordinated activity where you're willing to ask the right questions and pull apart the answers that you find and then revise your questions and ask better questions tomorrow. Yeah, really important. I don't think I could have done a job like that if I hadn't had the kind of blended experience across public and private sectors earlier on in my career. At that point, my wife was starting to get pretty sick of me always being away in kind of crazy environments. So I came back in-house, came back on shore, and I went to the city again. And I worked for a couple of years in a global resilience role for Deutsche Bank. I headed up their global recovery site management capability in the real estate team. So looking at what offices does the business need for contingency to fall back if an office is disrupted or unavailable, but doing it in a commercially sensitive way. So it's all very well saying, yes, we'll have a spare office, but that spare office needs to be paid for. And that spare office needs to be paid for, as does the furniture and the IT and the utilities and everything else. So how do you balance the supply-demand relationship in terms of risk and resilience to banking operations, highly regulated and high stakes, versus the realities of just increasing the cost base of the firm? I took on some other responsibilities at Deutsche Bank, and then my next role took me to JP Morgan, where I headed up their regional resilience function for Europe, Middle East and Africa, and then evolved into a resilience intelligence role, where we started looking at corporate offices worldwide and what is it that defines the requirements for a corporate office in order to be resilient. And to give you an idea of the scale, JP Morgan is approximately, or was at the time, 270,000 employees worldwide, operating in 80 countries with 500 plus corporate offices. So again, quite a focus, quite a scaled role.
Sizable.
Yeah. And then after the pandemic, after COVID, I decided to change, have a bit of a move into a new sector that I hadn't worked in before. I spent some time with a renewable energy startup, learning some fantastic things about power generation and tidal turbines that I'd never been exposed to before, and then was invited to join Cartier, the luxury goods brand, and established their business resilience function. So very fortunate in the opportunity there to come into luxury goods, a very tangible industry, synonymous with exquisite excellence. And I think with all of those experiences, it gives me a pretty unique way of looking at risk, whether it be from a service industry, whether it be from luxury goods, whether it be production, whether it be utilities, whether it be defense, whether it be oil and gas. And I think that leads me to believing there are better ways to approach resilience than perhaps traditional wisdom suggests.
Which I completely agree with. I think it's very rare to have someone with such diverse lived experience, but if I look at all of the guests that we've had on the podcast, the magic in which I hope the viewers get is that to hear the different perspectives, they tend to be people that have understood many walks of life and can think differently. They can see things from a different perspective and apply that thinking into a new way. It's almost the opposite to business as usual, and asking why. And that's something I know about you personally, is the inquisitive mindset, which I think is at the root of everything. It's critical thinking, it's asking why. And if people don't ask why, they'll never see everything which is in front of them. That's one of the qualities you have, which is applied in a way which perhaps hasn't been conventionally looked at, but I believe should.
No, thanks, Chris. That's very kind. I think it's the lived experience. If you've walked in the shoes, you're much more likely to theorize more comprehensively in the future. I think I am, I would never call myself an academic. I, went to a grammar school, did okay within a fairly intelligent cohort, was never motivated to study. I don't want to sit down and read a book. Give it to me, let me pull it apart, touch it, taste it, whatever. Then I learn quite quickly. And I think that's where, certainly my time in the military, lived experience, but particularly given my experience as a combat engineer, it led me to work with, around me and also, within my command, some fantastic soldiers who can challenge you on a daily basis. You can have fit, capable soldiers in many parts of the military, but I think the engineers are quite unique in that they're fit, capable soldiers, but they're bright and they will challenge you and they will test you. And if they think you're wrong, they will tell you. So from day one, you're a complex project manager in an environment where the tools are all very, very capable. And if they're not applied appropriately, that's on you. So I think understanding how you can have an effect if you work together, but how limited you are if you choose to work alone or you choose to be dictatorial, had a big impact on my early career. And, I love that experience that I've had because it's enabled me to look at business in a completely different way. And looking at business, working from oil and gas, which is very tangible, luxury goods, which is production and sales, very tangible, to, insurance and financial services, which is a little abstract for some people in terms of how does the business flow, how does it all work. What you tend to find is, in my experience at least, is that the more tangible the business's output, the easier it is to get people to understand physical, tangible risks. You work in a service industry, a service environment, it's a little bit abstract, so people don't really get that thing needs to be a focus. There's somebody else in the department somewhere that does that, so I don't need to do it.
But if you look at the biggest consequences over the last, let's say, 20 years, 2008 crash, economic crashes are in many ways deep circumstances that have affected every factor of life on a global basis, and probably every person in some way, shape or form, which are an absolute consequence of that intangibility being, it's not a thing, or it's not my problem. It's a cumulative effect of risk, where there was no real resilience.
It's a classic example, I think, of compound decision making leading to compound consequences.
Yeah.
And I think the more abstract the environment you work in, the less tangible it is, the less ownership there is. So if one person only owns part of the process, that trader makes the trade, he or she has no influence or leverage or ownership or agency on the middle office and the back office in order to square the circle for the bank. Now, in a physical production environment, it's very different, because you can identify gaps in the flow because the process flow is visible to everybody.
Yeah, if you're the guy that does the wheels and it goes through, the car's manufactured but there's no wheels, it's going to be pretty obvious.
Yeah, and it's that tangible kind of team ethic. And I think the way that that's most, obvious to most people is probably in professional sport. Yeah. You look at a football team, somebody doesn't do their job, there's a hole in the pitch, and it makes a difference. If, a mechanic makes a mistake on a pit stop in Formula One, the margins are seconds, but the consequences are enormous. So I think the tangibility, the focus, the ability with which people can see the purpose of what they do has a direct bearing on their acceptance of responsibility when it comes to risk and resilience.
Well, effectively, Newcastle having 2 points after 3 games is a direct consequence of not having the correct resource in place because he'd prefer to be on strike. But times have changed now. But I mean, that's a relatable way of looking at it.
Yeah, no, completely. In terms of resilience, how do we look at it? What does it really mean? There is a very traditional way to look at what we now call resilience, which used to be business continuity or kind of spin-off descriptions from that. It's a focus on not just what do we do when things go wrong, but it's in lockstep with the entire journey. How do we avoid it happening in the first place? What do we do if it happens to reduce the impact on us? And then, and only then, how do we adapt to the reality of it occurring, and what's our contingency? So I think there's a different way to look at resilience than the way most large organizations traditionally look at it, because you have a risk team looking at things slightly more proactively, and you have a resilience team looking at consequential contingency, etc. So they're not always joined up. And it's a horrible word to use, but you hear it all the time. It's a holistic thing. You've got to understand that risk will create uncertainty, negative impacts, consequences. That is a holistic threat. So your approach towards it to counter the risk, that resilience, must also be holistic in its design too.
So this season of the podcast, we focus very much on business, and I think that helps take us to the aggregation of all your experience, becoming a subject matter expert, and your responsibility today and one of the world's leading luxury brands. The partnership that we've, as a development partner, we've been working on together. Now is probably the first time in modern history that the application of technology is going to be capable of redefining how we can think about both risk and resilience, and how you've mapped, planned, understood, and been looking to change how business operates. And something which I think is very important. So a common theme that we hear is people will look at the application of AI, which is in a very general term. We're specifically working with advanced LGM-based AI and aggregating other particular forms of AI at the cutting edge to solve problems on scale under the redefinition or reimagining of resilience. So with that in mind, do you want to elaborate on that and explain to us, what is resilience?
To me, and there's lots of bright minds out there who will have a view on resilience, and I think it's important to state your position, state your claim, but also embrace that diversity and understand collectively what we think it is. In terms of my experience, both in hostile environments, but also complex corporate organizations as well, for me, it's about meeting the demands of a risk in an efficient way. And efficiency isn't the only consideration. It needs to be effective first, efficient probably second, and economical third in the business context. So you don't do something that's cheap if it doesn't work. It needs to work first, and the priorities there are sequential. So the best way I can kind of describe it is, in the context of risk to the business, what resilience is about is not fighting the rising tide. It's not trying to perhaps sometimes pretend that it can stop things happening, or you can avoid risk altogether. Risk is uncertainty, and it's uncertainty that matters. So that's why you care. So resilience is about maintaining buoyancy. So in order to do that, you need to understand physical conditions you find yourself in, the sea state, the weather, etc. And then your craft needs to be appropriate, not over-engineered, not under-engineered. So you need to have an eye on how those conditions can change. Now, in the business context, a bit like back in the military, resources are not unlimited. Some industries, I've worked in global banking institutions, and as you say now, a global luxury brand. Yeah, these are resource-rich, environments. However, the focus of resources needs to be, really well justified and proven to have a business positive impact effect. And resilience doesn't always translate that well, because it's very hard to put a cost benefit on avoiding something and ensuring it doesn't happen. If it didn't happen, how can you measure and gauge how much it really would have cost you, etc.?
Equally, there's probably the argument that you've got to be aware that there are circumstances which are negatively affecting a business in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Given a business, what is it? A business is an aggregation of lots and lots of different departments, all serving a common goal, which is the nature of that particular business. So you make stuff and you sell it.
Yeah.
For example, even in a bank, they have customers, there's investment banking, there's retail banking, but either which side, you need people, and those people are supporting that function. The majority of people that work in an organization, probably rightly so, are doing their job. And in order for them to do their job, other circumstances ideally must be true in the fact that they can do it. They have electricity, they have the building to work in, they have so many different things that it's the baseline. Before you begin, everything has to be there, and if you take any of those elements away, they can't be done. Or maybe things being done in a suboptimal manner because risks are translating into small losses but on scale. Therefore, the level of resilience is not really reflected or understood. And first off, if like being an alcoholic, the first stage is to admit you've got a problem. That then leads to the point of, how do people understand what they don't know they understand?
Yeah.
We're kind of getting a bit psychological now. But
no, it's true. I think the perception is there's the visible and the invisible. And I don't think that risk falls into the invisible. I think there's visible and not visible. And there's a distinct difference. I know it sounds quite semantic, but what is visible versus what is not visible all depends on where you're willing to look. If something's invisible, doesn't matter how hard you look, you're not going to see it. And I think in terms of resilience, it's about the appetite to look. So if we understand the environment in which we operate as a business, as you mentioned, the aggregation of collective effort, then not everybody is aware on a daily basis of what risks they face, the department faces, their team faces, the company faces, the group faces, depending on the context. But to provide guidance to an organization of this scale and these brands, these prestige, you have to have, I believe, a professional curiosity. You have to have a level of diligence and persistence. And you have to harness that. The wraparound has to be a humility to continuously question whether what we find out today is better than we knew yesterday. And what we find today, is it going to hold up tomorrow? So in terms of people's awareness of risk and resilience, the average employee in a role not in this space, in maybe they're a business focused function, maybe they're a support function, maybe they work in tech or HR or some of the, any of the classic service delivery functions you can think of, they're very much experts in their swim lane, in their field. The better people are able to consider empathetically the challenges of other departments with whom they interlink. But resilience needs to really understand everything from macro, question, and have the curiosity to then take some of those questions a little bit deeper, a little bit further. I don't need to be, an expert in investment banking. When I was at Deutsche or JP Morgan in the past, I don't need to be an expert in creating high jewelry in my current organization. But what I need to have is a professional curiosity to build a relationship with the person who is, in order that I can bring the not visible into the visible for them and me to help fix together.
It becomes a communication issue.
Yeah, definitely. It's about connecting, and so often, the right conversation will bring out so much knowledge, and the person that you're speaking to, the expert in this particular field, they actually know a lot of the things that need to be addressed. It's just not part of their visible, spectrum, unless you have that conversation with them.
For large organizations, it becomes very difficult when your remit is many territories.
Yes.
The lived experience of living in Tokyo is probably different to Paris, different to London, different to New York. But the remit could be singular across all of those, dealing with stakeholders in each particular area and understanding the nuances, but understanding if something is around you all the time, you often don't see the risk because you're almost acclimated to your surroundings. But the organization's appetite for risk obviously varies.
Your average employee goes to work each day. Maybe they commute on the train, or they drive. Part of the commute they won't recall as they step through the day. They'll almost arrive at work on autopilot and not realize actually the last hour or hour and a half that they've spent traveling, because it becomes so routine and so mundane, they're desensitized to it. Then when they arrive at work, everyone gets, kind of upset and disrupted about having to do a fire drill every now and again. But the reality is you have to do it because, people know how to exit the building. But if you ask somebody, where are the fire extinguishers you walk past every single day, 99% of people, won't be able to tell you. So even though they see it every day, they become desensitized to it. It becomes part of the normal fabric. And when you put people in, different organizations or different environments, or they come from a different culture, they operate in a certain way, it's not just about the physical environment that they exist in. It's also about the culture around risk and resilience. And some cultures are, much more sort of self-reflective, much more willing to challenge and have the humility to ask themselves questions brutally sometimes. And some cultures, even though something is patently wrong to everyone around you, they don't want to be the person to pass on the bad news, to give that message or to raise that issue. So you have to often, with multinational organizations, be really cognizant of that diversity, and find the best possible way to unlock that trust and truth in people so that the organization remains the focus and everybody has the common true north.
You've just mentioned an important factor there, trust and truth, which brings us on to the concept of data, information, intelligence, and leading to the point where what is it now that makes possible what was impossible before, when understanding organizational risk and subsequent actions around resilience?
So going back to the sort of professional curiosity and the appetite for diligent persistence, we have information available that can help us understand risk profiles, can help us understand what to do about those risks, help us understand what the correct treatments are to provide the resilience we seek. With the advent of technology at the current time, we are now seeing an ability to scale our information draw, which is just not feasible to do it manually. I can ask a question and I can go find an answer manually, but that takes time. In order to understand the context of a a business operating in a particular natural environment, subject to the infrastructure created around them in terms of built environment, and then all tempered within the culture and the geopolitics of the social environment, you're going to get a different answer to that question wherever you ask it. And the key is we can ask those questions and we can find those answers, but scale and reach make it not really a feasible, and in terms of business, cost-effective exercise to ask lots of questions in that way. Now, with the work that we've been doing in our development partnership, it's unlocked the potential for us to ask multiple questions of multiple locations simultaneously and bring back the answers in a conditioned way that we're able to do something with the output. So two golden principles here. We don't ask a question if we don't understand the answer that's going to come back. So you have to be careful, what question are we asking and why? So in terms of resilience, my focus has been trying to map the environmental factors and say, right, within the natural environment, what are the resilience indicators? What are we concerned about? So we think about things like geology, hydrology, we think about meteorology, we think about ecology. And within that, lots and lots of different questions. In the built environment, we look at the utilities, the infrastructure, the transport systems that we rely upon. We want things to maintain a level of service to us if we rely upon them. And we also want certain things in these spaces perhaps not to happen if that creates disruption for us. So again, there are different ways to ask the question around an indicator. Overlaid on the natural and the built, we look at the social and we say, right, okay, how is it that man behaves and operates in that environment that changes the potential for disruption to our business? And it could be geopolitical tension, it could be conflict, it could be economic stress, there could be social issues, it could be the level of industrialization in a country and the propensity towards industrial action, these sorts of things. And it could be the game changers. It could be, guess what, the Olympics is coming to town next year. Right, well, that changes everything. So now we've got to rethink through these things.
Because it's almost the question, well, what does that mean? Because this is where a subject matter expert who knows, well, I've got all this information and will understand which question to ask.
Yes.
Most of the time, people, probably they won't have access to all the information, so they won't have context and they won't know what question to ask. This is even before they get to the answer, because again, one answer to one person who knows what they're talking about, as opposed to someone else, it could mean something entirely different.
100%. And this is where, and I'll give you a sort of little story. Years ago when I was working in financial services, we were looking at how to ask the right questions for a different project. And one of the examples which brings this subjective expertise really to light is one of the things we look at in the infrastructure environment, transport environment, is congestion, you're on the roads. So is it a consideration or a factor for the business to think about traffic patterns? Well, if you're a big organization in a busy city with a lot of employees and you want them all to work on site, they've got to get there somehow. So you really should think about choosing the right site for your office or your shop or whatever your business is in the first place, which means asking the right questions before you select that site. So when you say to real estate, go find me some sites that are available for lease or purchase, are you asking them to just go find you available locations, or are you asking them to find you available locations that are appropriate given the criteria we've considered for the resilience of the organization?
Proper transportation links.
Exactly. So, without making that, the longest question set in the world, what we really want to do is clarify what are the things we're interested in, make that part of the property search criteria. And then when real estate, then bring back your long list and short list of properties, and then you finally select the right property, it's considered all of these things in the tapestry of the decision. Mm-hmm. So if you have a high-end boutique where you want to sell luxury goods to private clients, you don't really want to be over the street from the local fire station, where the sirens and the bells and the clanging is all happening all the time. Equally, if you want to have a, let's say, spa or wellness clinic or something, you're not going to choose the retail location that looks great that's next to the university and the square where all of the protests begin and then march around the city. So it's not that these questions are invisible, it's just that they're not visible when the business says to real estate, go find me a property.
Often, as in many things in life, things are not obvious until they are.
Yes.
And I mean, the amount of times I've sat on my car key and driven down the road with the boot open, and some random person sort of waves me down the street, I'm thinking, this is dodgy because I haven't been aware. But how can you drive along in a car and not notice your boot is open? You know what type of car it is, so it should be quite obvious because it's masking then the rear view mirror. But no, then I feel quite embarrassed because I'm thinking, right, the person hailing me down the street is not some random nutter there letting me know that my boot is open.
And it's we live in a in a fast-paced world. We live in a world with access to technology, with the availability of reach. We live in a world where everyone is a 2020 hindsight expert on the things that you didn't do right. And the reality is that we can be better at delivering resilience if we are structured around the questions we ask. So I talk about now in the sort of commercial world, the natural, the built, social environments. If you understand that they are the three spheres that dictate our physical existence, you can break each of them down, as I did earlier, to say, well, actually within that there's a ton of indicators. Each indicator is a thing. So within the natural environment, the geological subsection, you say, right, volcanoes, earthquakes. Everyone's going to be an expert. So, well, of course you're going to ask that question. But what question are you really asking? Like, are there earthquakes here? Yes or no? Well, there are apparently, but I've never experienced one. So how are you going to answer that question? The data, if we access the right golden sources of information that we can trust, and we know that what they provide is truthful, and we can trace how we've got there, we can show our working with that research, then you can say, well, actually, from this trusted source that is absolutely credible, we can tell you the history of occurrences. And in terms of earthquakes, easy, because we can say, right, how frequently did they occur or have they occurred? Can't predict the future. What is the magnitude? So how bad were they when they occurred? Where exactly did they occur, and what's the proximity to the location we're interested in? So we can look at frequency, magnitude, proximity, and we can use our own calculations designed to support the questions that we think are important for our business, to then turn that into something we can do something about. So you can say, well, look, they happen all the time, they're really bad and they're really close, versus actually they're not that frequent and they're only minor and they tend to be quite a distance away. Now, the reality is that no place on the planet is free from earthquakes. It's just they're not necessarily perceptible because we don't all live on the Pacific Ring of Fire. But you will see in the press, certainly in the last year, there's been a couple of examples of earthquakes in locations that people never thought that there would be one. But it just shows you that actually asking the right question will be able to bring you the right information and turn that into intelligence to then allow us to actually treat those risks. And if it means we have selected a building which now we think maybe we shouldn't have, the business is not likely to rip up that lease and move at a huge cost, right? But it means the next time there is a lease event, so the lease is up for renewal or there's a consideration or a break clause, it means that the business and the real estate team have the information to ask the right questions next time round. So what we're doing is we're bringing forward and into the visible spectrum the things that can help us in the longer term. And the marriage that we have to consider in resilience is we're not core business, we're a support function to a business that in my current situation makes stuff and sells stuff. The exquisite beauty and complexity of what the organization produces doesn't make the business complex, that makes that sub-function complex. But the business needs to make and sell. So the resilience we provide in terms of advice and offer and procedures and and programs is all designed to sit in the context of that. So it needs to be cost effective. It needs to be efficient in terms of change management. It needs to be empathetic to the rest of the organization.
I think there's culture change as well. And culture change, and this is happening across the board. And an example which has been pointed out with numerous guests, more so specifically from an AI perspective, but people at home using ChatGPT, going into the workplace where some tools are not suited to the workplace for security reasons and various other things. But people who, if they use them at home, they want to be able to use them at work. So that's a culture change issue. Now, there are very good reasons LLMs typically are not used in business to the level and the degree that is safe. So that means you've got this cultural block. But if you can create a situation where you have value created, you can have a flow of information, but that can be distilled and understood, then instead of one person in management saying, no, that's not how we do it, because it's almost like the propagation of business as usual. Well, this is how we do it. Why? Because we always did it that way. But people can see, well, there is a better way of doing it. Creating culture change through actually providing value and informing people to say, look, we appreciate this is your function. We want to help you specifically with your function, and anything which may stop you from performing your tasks, your roles, getting your bonuses, whatever it could be, because if you can't do your job and you can't get the benefits and you're meeting the metrics of how you're measured because of things out of your control, well, could they be in your control, or could you rejig things so it's not going to be a problem? In many ways, resilience is creating a circumstance where if the inevitable happens, then it doesn't really make any difference. I mean, you told me years ago, what's the best way to avoid getting hit by a tsunami? And it was, well, pick a building 100 foot and higher in elevation. I mean, it sounds very simple, but on an insular, isolated basis, of which there are hundreds of thousands of decisions, which aren't taking everything else into consideration, to be able to take everything into consideration individually, it does reveal a massive amount of avoidable mistakes. At which point, if you're looking at it purely from the top end of the business, well, that moves the needle. From the individual, any particular role, region, office, building, manufacturing place, it moves the needle. And that's the rethinking which I think is so important.
Yeah, and it is important, and it's when you talk about culture change, what you're really trying to overcome is individual, institutional, collective bias. You know, the sort of, like you say, the worst question in the world, you know, why do we do it like that? Sorry, the worst answer is we've always done it like that. That's not what I asked. I asked why we do it like that. And the answer is we do it like that because you haven't thought about whether we should do it any different. And again, that isn't down to a lack of information, a lack of available information. That's down to a lack of professional curiosity and the persistent diligence in pursuing the most useful information possible. And you're right, yeah, the example you give about tsunami, you know, if you approach risk treatment which leads to resilience in a logical and structured way, there's no risk that you cannot find treatments for. So traditionally, businesses will look at business resilience as a kind of evolution of what we used to call business continuity, for example. So business continuity is the discipline that looks at how do we continue business in the face of X disruption. And my fundamental issue with that way of thinking is your start point is it's happened. and therefore your start point, it's already too late. So the workaround of a disruption that has occurred, of course there's a place for it, but that's not the be all and end all, and it's certainly not the most efficient business focus. A different discipline in the organization, whether it's operational risk or embedded in the business itself, will look at controls and mitigation measures in order to address different facets of the risk. So I'll give you an example. Your generic risk assessment, if people have never seen one, will have some form of calculation providing you a risk product based on two factors. So the two factors are likelihood and impact. You may see some places people will change likelihood for probability or frequency. Basically, how much of a thing am I exposed to? The second factor is impact, and you might see that in terms of severity or other descriptors. But that part of the question says, well, if it happens and I'm exposed to it, how bad is it to me? So how likely is the thing to happen, and how bad is it if it does occur? Now, if we measure risk based on those two factors, we should, logically speaking, provide resilience also based on two counter factors. Now, historically, we'll look at likelihood and impact, and then in two questions, and then we'll understand risk in two questions. But then we'll ask the resilience question in one question. How do we reduce risk? And what you do is you then lose the sensitivity of the question to say, well, what do we do about impact? What do we do about likelihood? Completely different measures. But when you ask one question, it then makes it quite hard to see a way through, to understand what steps am I taking and what is that achieving. So the approach that I advocate is that we focus on likelihood first. Back to your tsunami example, the best way to not suffer the impacts of a tsunami is not be exposed to it in the first place. Yeah. So site selection isn't going to stop the tsunami occurring, but it will stop it happening to you. So to you, that is controlling likelihood. Then if it does occur, then you look at mitigating the impact of it. And it might be, well, it would cause flooding, it would cause, power outages, and we might want to have generators in the building to ensure the power. Well, if we know that it's an area likely to flood or be affected by flooding, we might not want to put those generators in the basement. These kinds of things. These are all ways to, if it happens, how do we prepare ourselves to overcome the thing that's occurred? Business continuity traditionally looks at the next step, the third element. So control, mitigation, and now contingency. And if business continuity is focused on contingency alone, no one's joining the dots between working out what do we do to control, what do we do to mitigate, and what contingencies do we require. And I think the best way to support business, the best way to understand that within a business the bottom line is the bottom line, you have to have an eye on efficiency. You have to put that in context and say, well, look, if there's a risk that we face, can we control it out? And if you can control it out to such a level that you're comfortable with the risk, what we would say is now within risk appetite, why spend money on mitigation? Why spend money on further contingency? So actually, as part of a holistic sequential process, control is always the best way to go. So design your footprint, design your buildings, hire the right people, secure your possessions, maintain the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your information, and also protect your reputation. Do those things proactively, embedded in the experts in their fields in the organization, whether that's HR or comms or real estate. Then you're less likely to have exposure to some of these risks becoming a reality. If you can't control them out, then focus on reducing the impact. And then if that's still not within appetite after those two treatments, then and only then consider the contingency. So in the context of financial services, a lot of banking offices will have critical functions that regulators do not want to see disrupted. So investment banking, for example, trading floors, say foreign exchange or some complex derivatives or whatever it might be. The people doing those jobs cannot be disrupted. So the bank will provide a secondary office to fall back to. So if location A is unavailable for whatever disastrous reason, location B will be the place that those people will go and work from. It could be an occupied site, it could be another office, it could be a mothballed site that gets spun up and then ready to receive people only in extremis. Now, those things all cost money. So in terms of delivering the right solution to the bank, don't put yourself in harm's way in the first place. Now, you don't need the second property. Very simplistic model, but there are ways in which we can treat risk, which if you focus on business continuity alone, you'll never come across.
This is a fascinating point. I heard once that one major bank set up a disaster recovery site in the building next door. So if there's a problem affecting the primary building, chances are, for example, power outage, that it affects the street, which kind of made the next building pretty silly. So I think somebody didn't get the memo on what that meant.
And yeah, that's a perfect example of the visible versus the not visible. When that site was selected, did anyone ask the question, is site A and site B connected to the same substation on the power grid? So you can ask these questions. You can understand and decipher and derive the risk profile if you're willing to ask the right questions. And until the advent of technology that's now becoming available, there have been too many questions for too few people to ask for too many locations at the pace that the business requires them. And business gets wrapped up in the decisions that have been made and let's maintain momentum. The time taken to really inform that first decision that's made doesn't always include all the right stakeholders. And this is where if resilience is plugged into the earlier stages, actually for the business, there is a much better financial outcome because you don't spend time overcoming something that didn't need to happen to you. And you certainly don't spend resources creating a contingency that you could have treated in another more efficient way.
2 points that you've mentioned there. Appetite, and I'd like to elaborate on what appetite means because I think that's very important. And second of all, where AI can help is key leading indicators, because probably everything that is going to happen has happened numerous times before. And usually by the time something happens, that's 0.5. Key leading indicators are 0.1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you're assessing your entire organization, global footprint, the questions are, what's the probability of happening? What's the current situation? And how does the reality of that, we know it probably can be seen, and we can see where any particular location or circumstance is with the view of key leading indicators, which are truth and trust based, so they have credibility and we understand where it's coming from. And second of all, how does that marry up with the appetite of what could be deemed a tragic circumstance with potentially someone dying in a store? Ask the same question to 5 different people, what the appetite is. I think you started off by saying, does anyone have the appetite for some dying? Obviously everyone says no, but I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, it's a really horrible hypothetical circumstance to use, but that's the whole point, is if you can bring something into discussion that allows people to have a very clear opinion on, they stake their claim to yes or no or whatever it might be, then you can challenge how they've come about this. So the more emotive the subject matter, actually the easier it is to prove the point. So if you have a business that is, we're in a world of increasing inequality, economic pressures, and some countries that leads to increased crime levels. Do you have an appetite for your staff being mugged on the way home? Well, of course not. Absolutely not. No business is going to say, yeah, that's fine. But the reality of what do you do about the risk of that happening leads you to a question about appetite in a different way. Are you willing to move your corporate office or your store or your whatever your business is to another location because last year someone got mugged on the way home? Well, no. So do you have an appetite for it to happen? No. But are you going to change your business model because it's happened? No. So one says we don't have an appetite, and actually if you're not willing to do anything about it, you're articulating that you actually are going to just roll with it. And in risk sense, that states you have an appetite for it. Now, it's a really hard discussion and conversation to have because it's very emotive, and it sounds like you're really pointing out that people are lacking empathy or, you know, sort of don't care. But what you're trying to get people to do is to zoom out from the emotional and think about the context of the business. And if these things really do matter to you, and you think, actually, yeah, do you know what, we should look at the crime rates, and this is an issue, and actually the economic situation is going to potentially lead to increasing crime, and we have this big shiny skyscraper next to the most deprived borough in the city, whatever it might be, then you can ask the smart question before you take that lease out: is this the right place to locate ourselves? Are we putting ourselves in harm's way, directly or indirectly, by the decision to take that building because the cost per square foot is cheaper?
There's probably a reason somewhere would be cheaper as well. But again, if you zoom out and you begin to see the trajectory, for example, socioeconomic, so crime going up, poverty going up in a particular area, and someone just seeing the metrics of, well, price per square foot here is really good, but you're kind of putting something in someone's face, and you're then inviting 3,000 people to come and telling them to work in an office, which, as you said, opens a socio-economic butting of heads, because you're putting it in people's faces, and saying, look, we're the wealthy ones and we've taken cheap space on your place. But is there urbanization? Look at places like Shoreditch. So Shoreditch has evolved over there. Is it what's the term?
Gentrification.
That's the one.
We're seeing that right now. It's a really topical point, Graham. We're seeing increased protests in Mexico because the Mexican population are really feeling the pinch socially, economically. Organized crime situation in Mexico is particularly stark. You have therefore a social backlash towards foreign expressions of wealth and luxury. So you see, you know, protests in Mexico City in the last few days, where, you know, some elements of Mexican society are really voicing their discomfort with the gentrification of parts of Mexico City, because it's pricing people out. You know, that's a given that everyone kind of understands, but they feel it's diluting the social fabric of the place that they call home. And given other geopolitical tensions at the current time, there's a bit of a perfect storm, which is now leading to more protests. But actually, it's not one issue, it's multiple issues, but it's only bubbling to surface because of the cumulative effect of these multiple simultaneous issues. And that's another thing that we look at and we say, well, look, is the geopolitical, you know, situation in that country a problem for what we want to do in that market? And the answer might simply be no. But is the geopolitical situation in a neighbouring country something that has the potential to change the geopolitical situation in the country we're focused on? Is there an indirect or a third order effect or something that could come from this? You ask those questions, sometimes you will find something that's, you know, a little bit different. We can look at existing conflicts in the world now, and with hindsight say, well, yeah, we could have thought about this, we should have thought about that. But we can apply that learning to tomorrow's conflicts and look at where tension exists, or look at where the political rhetoric has changed, looking where the voting in a country has led to a particular political shift or swing, and how is that whipping up sentiment? You know, how is that changing what's going on? We see protests in the UK, you know, through the summer, people really believing what they're protesting against, arguable drivers of why they're protesting against it, but a total dismissal of the conditions and the considerations of people they're protesting against and people on the other side of the fence. Also, I mean, in the Netherlands where I live, there is a case recently where, you know, a young girl was out with friends, cycling home because she didn't want to leave her bike in the city for fear it might get stolen. And then cycling home, she was attacked. And the feeling is that we shouldn't be afraid in our own country. Now, looking from the outside in, you wouldn't think that that's really an issue in somewhere as egalitarian and, kind of open a society as the Netherlands is, but sentiments are changing. Look across, Europe at the moment, look across much of the developed world, you're seeing polarized, political feeling. You're seeing swings to the left, shifts to the right. And it's not just what's happening in that country, it's the context of the other countries and the understanding of this macro environment that actually allows business to ask the right questions if you pull it into the visible. If you ask that question, you go down the rabbit hole and do something deliberate with what you find out, you can make better business decisions when it comes to your resilience in the longer term.
And in a global economy, I mean, without specifically naming countries, supply chains could be affected. There could be a change in the financial industry due to political decisions, tariffs, for example. If you've got a global footprint, suddenly everything's your problem.
Mm-hmm.
And all these micro issues, you can say, well, that's got nothing to do with my business. But if you are sourcing rare metals, and if you have international supply chains, if your manufacturing is in a certain place, and the landscape is shifting under your feet perpetually, then you begin to realize how important the true concept of resilience is.
Yeah.
It's observation of everything as is, whilst understanding the question of context. Well, what does it mean to me? How does it fit within my appetite? And of course, even within one organization, there could be multiple different appetites and multiple different cause and effects. And often it comes down to, well, you and this position and this function within the company, what is the metric upon which you are judged?
Yeah.
Successful or unsuccessful. And the same goes for everyone in any company. There's always a remit. There's always what good looks like and bad looks like. But there's probably tens of thousands of contexts.
There are. And where you choose to operate, how you choose to evolve your supply chain, your service chain, the footprint you create, or that is a collection of deliberate individual choices. So there is a tapestry to the footprint that you have now created based on the individual threads of the decisions you made along the way. It's not that your footprint, physical footprint as a business has happened by accident. You've chosen to offshore, you've chosen to outsource, or the converse. So when you made those decisions, was resilience a consideration? And, arguably, yes, it's a consideration, but were the right questions asked, and was the information available? And then looking back now with hindsight, actually, can we test that again? And so often you find that organizations did have the ability, did have the reach, but perhaps didn't get the right advice, or were guided by particular opportunities and outcomes. Maybe that weighted the decision, and then the risks and the resilience element wasn't really given the leverage that it perhaps should have had. There isn't the appetite, the time, the resource to go back and rethink every thought we've ever had. But technology now allows us to bring information we can trust from organizations and data sources that are truthful to the business in rapid time, with quality intelligence brought to bear, allowing us to at least have a grown-up discussion about the truth that we know. And this is where reach and scale based on trust and truth is something, back to your early question, just isn't something we've had before. It hasn't been possible.
In a year's time, based upon the capability that we've been working on collaboratively together, what would you see that capability being possible, which is not possible in this world today?
The possibilities are quite interesting. Based on some of the guests you've had on already, it's been enthralling but also really entertaining. Hearing people talk about how this capability, these discussions, how it kind of plays out in the business. So the classic boardroom setting. I think one of your guests mentioned that, the CFO in the room immediately jumps on, we've got this capability, brilliant. How many headcount can I cut? So it's not about how much cost can we reduce tomorrow. It's about what can we do that we couldn't do before. So this is about becoming better informed. And as you say, we are working very closely together in this partnership, which has been an unbelievable eye-opener for me, about not just asking the right questions, asking the questions in the right way and understanding what to do with them. If we bring that capability to bear in a way that is trusted across the organization, in a year's time, it's not the security, resilience, crisis management, focus. It becomes an embedded part of how real estate go and find property. It becomes an embedded part about how technology selects their data center providers or other vendors. It becomes a fundamental tool with which we collaborate with our insurance brokers to work together with the underwriters to ensure that the assurance needed by party 2 is provided by party 1. And the insurance example is a fantastic one. I remember you had Lee Howell on here a couple of episodes ago. It's fascinating to listen to because I can see how what we're developing really it nestles with the challenges in the insurance industry, the financial services at large. It's about providing the assurance to say, what risk do we face? And the client's going to have one view on that risk, and the underwriter is potentially going to have a different view on the risk. For example, let's take the domestic situation, right? I want a new car insurance policy, and the insurer asks me, how many accidents have you had in the past? How many miles do you drive a year? The average consumer will always look to play down those metrics wherever they can because it will have a discernible impact on the insurance policy that's offered. So they'll underestimate how much they drive or deliberately reduce the number to the underwriter. What that means is the insurer will have to bake in that uncertainty, bake in that additional risk to the cost of the premium. And it means that the client still ends up paying, and there's a bigger gap between the risk that's insured and the risk that's really borne. So if you have this trust and truth around resilience and how we select our buildings and how we build our workforce and how we invest in our technology and how we secure our possessions, how we protect our reputation, if you have a really comprehensive and embedded intelligent program providing guidance to the organization within, there are clear commercial benefits, not just to the institution trying to reduce its insurance premium, but the clarity with which the insurance industry can provide its services, knowing with a greater deal of certainty what they're really being exposed to. So that's one example.
And potentially through to customers as well.
Absolutely. Any organization that's able to, reduce cost or increase efficiency is going to be, able to be more competitive in the marketplace. Or if it's able to maintain prices, it's going to be more profitable in the medium to long term.
And that tends to be the thing that people miss. If you can do things properly, and this allows resilience and risk to be addressed on a huge scale, but on a extremely regular, recurring, almost like an observational real-time perspective of what do I have to worry about today? That, and that. Okay, well, if I've addressed that, what do I have to worry about? You're good until circumstances change. Given the world is always changing, I mean, the organization may say, this is how we set up. We're good. But if everything around it changes, but isn't being observed, then that answer, which was true yesterday, may be false today. Yeah. So I think that as a capability, going back to the point of what I think that provides incredible value, if that value is executed on a moment-by-moment basis perpetually across the world and the footprint of organization, then ultimately it's gonna affect everything else in a positive manner because you're taking out the problematic elements which do affect the bottom line.
So this chimes very well with the concept again that I advocate. It's reinforcing familiarity. So the more we make something familiar, the less of an additional stressor it becomes. So we drive somewhere we've never been before, you're much more focused on navigation than driving somewhere that you go every day. So the familiarity of it actually means you're consciously focusing on a lot less because you don't need to. So if you put that in the context of resilience, yeah, we do plan things and we do practice things, and we ask our staff to do a fire evacuation every now and again because we need it to be familiar. But in the same way, going back to my time in the military, there would be a phrase banded around, train hard, fight easy. The harder you make the training, the more familiar you make discomfort, and the Army's quite good at making discomfort familiar. Then when you have to go and do it for real, actually it's not just the physical muscle memory, it's not just the psychological conditioning, it's just part of what you do. You don't question it as a unique occurrence or something out of the norm. You do it all the time, so it's very familiar. In the same way that athletes train, anyone who's any good at anything practices it. You reinforce familiarity and it reduces the stress, and when you do that, you actually enable yourself, your organization, your party to then consider things you didn't consider before. So with what we're doing with the profiling for resilience in this case, using the LGM technology, is we are making a lot of known unknowns known knowns, and we're by definition then pulling everything into the visible space, which is making it more familiar, which is then allowing us the bandwidth to focus on the things we didn't consider before. And over time, those things will become more familiar. So it allows us not just, a different way of operating perhaps in the next 6 to 12 months, a different way of operating absolutely in the next 24 to 48 months, but just think how this extrapolation will go and what we'll be capable of doing in the future.
It will become almost like the central nervous system of base operations of an organization lined up to be successful.
And fundamentally, the principle that drives me is, if you can know, why on earth wouldn't you want to know? Why wouldn't you ask the question in order to inform your decision?
Especially when your job depends on it, quite literally.
Yeah.
There's no room for blissful ignorance.
No. And if you are a senior leader, if you are, a pillar of industry or a CEO of a multinational, or you're a star general in the military or whatever it might be, if you are responsible for an organization, it's not just about the performance metrics of the organization. It's about the people. It's about everything to do with the decisions you make. Even if the things that drive you are ego and legacy and whatever, again, why wouldn't you want to know? Why wouldn't you want to be informed? Why wouldn't you want to make the best decisions available? And these decisions are available if you maintain the right professional curiosity and the right diligent persistence to go down that rabbit hole.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think what we're doing here and where this will go will fundamentally change how risk and resilience is thought about, considered, and implemented.
I think so. And I think the more that we engage, the more that we try to understand, in my type of function, what it is the business really wants, what is it they're really trying to achieve, the more we'll be able to add value. And then it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. It's like, well, the more we add value, the more we'll be engaged. So I think over time, there has to be a different way big organizations look at resilience. It hasn't been the way it's been done in the past. And I think part of the issue, and I mentioned, business continuity traditionally being a contingency-led activity, it's late to the party. The reality of its lack of priority means it's also generally populated by less dynamic characters. Not to say people aren't capable, they're not bright, they don't have the influence in the organization. They can't push their way to the table, and no one's going to invite them to the table. So I genuinely believe the best way that I can deliver for the businesses I support is to put myself in a position where I understand the needs of the person I'm communicating with, and I ask the questions on their behalf. And I show them what it is we're capable of doing in the interest of whetting their appetite to learn more, to know more, to then reinforce the familiarity with them of asking these right questions to then embed that in their own process. And the reality of resilience is the better resilience professionals are at their job, the less they're required.
It's creating a culture of success.
Yep.
And on that note, Jon, it's been a pleasure.
Graham, thank you very much. Likewise.
Excellent.